I have been spending a lot of time in the state of Washington, where our patients aren't having a great time, and I want to bring that perspective to you all. When I first started Americans for Safe Access, something that my allies in drug policy reform would always ask me is, if we legalize marijuana for everyone, won't that be enough for patients? Won't that just fix all of your problems? And over the years, I've gotten in these conversations about why I didn't think that they were the same system, or that just by legalizing marijuana for everyone would really meet the needs of patients. And now we're not looking at a crystal ball anymore, right? We're actually working in states that have legalization on the books, and we have sort of a tale of two states that I want to put in front of you. In the state of Colorado, there was a robust medical cannabis program on the books when they passed their legalization bill. Right, so 2011, we passed a robust regulatory system in the state of state of Colorado, and that program, when the legalization program was voted on and they were implementing it, that program just kind of sat next to the medical cannabis one. It didn't interfere with it, right? And in Colorado, people loved that medical cannabis program. It was one of the first commercially regulated systems. And luckily, people in the state of Colorado really want to see that program succeed. So they successfully have implemented a legalization program next to a medical program. In the state of Washington, in 2011, we tried to pass a regulatory bill for the state of Washington. And we passed it actually in the House and the Senate. And when it went to the governor's desk, she got a letter from U.S. attorneys threatening her and her staff, and said if she signed it, that the U.S. attorneys could go after her employees. And so she vetoed the bill. So that was 2011. 2012, the legalization initiative was on the ballot in Washington state, and it passed. So in 2013, 2014, we kept hearing from legislators and folks, we'll just wait and deal with medical after we finish implementing the 502 program. This year, there have been three, actually at this point there's 5 bills that have been introduced in the state of Washington, and they're all pretty frightening. And they're mostly calling for getting rid of the medical cannabis program altogether, and just folding everything into the legalization program. And there's been some pretty offensive language being used in Washington about medical cannabis patients. There was a report that was commissioned by the state of Washington to help guide administrators on implementing the law, basically to look at how is this going to work. And the report came back and said there were going to be 2 major problems in the state of Washington with regulating or with implementing the legalization. The first, which is the largest problem, was the taxation is so high that the estimated 13% of Washingtonians that smoke pot recreationally are going to stay within the illicit market, right? There's already a culture of cannabis in the state of Washington. Obviously, 13% of the population knows where to get it, and they are going to continue to use the illicit market because they're not going to pay those taxes. Does that make sense? But that's a huge population, right? 13%. The smaller problem, which is actually less than 1% of the population of Washington, actually less than 0.5% of the population of Washington, is the medical cannabis patients. That by having 2 programs, one that isn't regulated, and one that isn't taxed, that you would have people just flooding to the medical cannabis program, right? So those are the 2 major problems that they saw. So they've now begun implementing the law under the Liquor Control Board. And the mission of the Liquor Control Board is to control things, right? So the way that they've chosen to implement 502 is that they didn't want to have any excess marijuana, right? So they actually haven't fulfilled the licenses that the initiative asked for, right? And you have 40% of the cities in Washington state have banned 502 stores. They've said that we don't want them at all. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. So what's been happening in the sort of absence of statewide legislation in Washington is very similar to what's been going on in California. Cities and counties have stepped up and created regulatory schemes, right? In Seattle, there's a license that people can get. Tacoma, Spokane, they've all created their sort of own local license waiting for the state. Right? But after this report came out, we started hearing comments from Seattle's city attorney and actually some of our allies, maybe former allies at the ACLU, that said that 90% of the people participating in the medical cannabis program in Washington are faking it. 90%, right? And so I actually confronted Pete Holmes and asked him, where are you getting this number? And he said, well, everybody knows it. And I was like, well, the thing is that a percentage means at some point there was a number, right? You can't just say a percentage if it's not based on some number. He had no number. And so I asked him if he pulled it out of his ass, and he said he pulled it out of Mark Kleiman's ass, this person who wrote the report. Not really, didn't quite say it that way, but that was just the gist, right? And you know, as a medical cannabis patient, that sort of discriminatory language is shocking, right? Especially when you're someone like me that's traveling around talking about medical cannabis in 34 states right now, and I'm working with governments in Georgia and Alabama that want to get medical cannabis to their citizens, right? So I sort of stepped back looking at Washington. I was like, why are we having this conversation? How is this even happening? And I realized that the last time that medical cannabis advocates had really done a statewide education campaign on medical cannabis was actually in 1998 when they passed the initiative, the first initiative in Washington. And the campaign to pass that initiative was actually very similar to the campaign to pass 215 here in California, right? And the messaging around those campaigns was basically, if you're dying, you should get to smoke pot, right? That's not quite medical cannabis, right? So I think, you know, and definitely in California, maybe in Washington, you could have substituted that language, you know, people who are dying should be able to use hookers and heroin, right? Like it's the same sort of concept. If you're dying, you shouldn't go to jail, right? But that's not what we see as medical cannabis, right? And it maybe makes sense, right? The endocannabinoid system wasn't even discovered until 1994, right? So these first laws were compassionate use bills, right? They're just saying, you have nothing, you know, nothing else works and you're dying, you should try this. What we have realized is that we're living with medical cannabis, right? You can't look at me and know what condition I have, because I have a ton of cannabinoids in my system right now that are making me able to move around and talk to you all, right? If you took those cannabinoids out of my system and came and found me in 3 days, I would be balled up on the floor, not able to move, right? So when you're living with cannabis, that means that just an exemption of a criminal law isn't enough to serve our needs, right? It means that we still have to function in society. It means that we're going to still need to drive. It means we're still going to have kids, have homes, have jobs, right? And none of those first laws really saw that. But the conversation, right, if you believe that the totality of medical cannabis is that if you're dying, you should get to smoke pot if you want to, then it would make sense to just push those people into a recreational system, right? Because they're dying, and they won't be around for long, and we won't need anything else, right? So as an organizer, something that I always look at a political situation, and I try to figure out what piece do I have control over, right? What pieces maybe did I contribute to? And I think that both in Washington and in California, to be frank, we've really kind of been idle on the fact that we have 80% support, right? It's felt nice every time we poll people. They love medical cannabis, and so we just assumed that they were with us. But what I'm afraid of is that the support and knowledge of medical cannabis in the state of California is paper thin, right? That people don't really understand the extent of what we mean by medical cannabis. We don't understand the extent of the patients that are being helped and the greater impacts that have happened to California because of these laws. And so I think that over the last few years, we've tried to pass statewide legislation here in California, and we had a bit of a, I don't know, sort of a laissez-faire attitude, because we were like, we can do it next year. Oh, we can just take care of that next year. It's not perfect. We can take care of it next year. And I'm afraid we're running out of next year's, right? And I know that we're going to talk a lot about things that are going on at the local level, and that's enough to keep anyone busy, right? Running from, city to city, dealing with our city council members, working with the counties, working with board of supervisors. I know that that takes a lot of effort, and it's definitely what's closest to you. But if we don't pass statewide legislation this year, then I'm afraid we're going to find ourselves in a situation like what we're seeing in Washington State, right? So the proposals to get rid of the medical cannabis program there are coming from a few places, but they're mostly coming from people who own the recreational stores, and it's pretty frightening. I mean, I think even though it's been very frustrating for us to have law enforcement as our largest opponent traditionally, right? That's usually who doesn't want us to succeed. The one good thing about them being our main opponent was that they actually had a limited budget, right? At least we knew, like law enforcement, they couldn't, they couldn't hire all the PIs they wanted. They couldn't do any of that. But private companies have endless resources. And so what we're seeing in Washington State are some of these companies hiring private investigators to go into the medical cannabis facilities, trick them into using, letting them in with a letter that isn't legitimate, right? And so it's a frightening situation, and one I don't think any of us want to be dealing with in California post 2016. Does that make sense?